Hello, everyone. I'm John Farrell, senior editor here. I mostly cover tabletop and independent film, but today we're going to be talking about video games with Ross Scott. You probably know him as the creator of Freeman's Mind and Civil Protection. On Accursed Farms, he does a lot of sort of gaming anthropology to find old hidden games that aren't necessarily gems, but are the sort of weird things that you probably don't know about, but you really need to hear about. And in terms of things you need to hear about, he is the only person, as far as I know, who is spearheading this effort to make sure that video game companies stop destroying their products and, more importantly, stop disallowing you from owning and using things that you've already paid for. So, thanks so much for doing this work. I know it's probably frustrating that larger groups aren't doing it. I know it's very difficult, especially on your own, but you and a community of people have been working on this. And if you know nothing else, go to stopkillinggames.com. You can learn more about how you can get involved and what you can do to try to address this problem.
Yeah, wasn't sure if I should start talking yet or not. Uh, yeah, the situation is certain types of video games that require an online connection. I think I did an unofficial test a few years ago. About 97% of them, once they're done with support and they decide, okay, we're going to shut down the servers, they give you absolutely no way to ever play that game again. And this used to be a pretty rare thing, and instead it's just slowly, I feel like it's creeping up on like an exponential curve, just very slowly. And
Yeah,
it's
it does. It really feels like a boiling the frog situation where, so you have a game and they'll put less content in it and worse content, and they'll release it and it's blatantly unfinished and it will cost more. And now it's getting to a point where even if it's a single player game, you're required to have an online connection to play it. And at some point, with no warning and recourse, they'll say, and by the way, even though you paid full price for this, you can never access it again. There's nothing you can do. And in some places, it's legal.
yeah, well, some places being the United States, which I found out more recently. But yeah, well, actually, the quality of the game that's completely independent of what I'm doing. See, if in fact, if all these games were bad, I probably wouldn't be animated to do much about it because then I would think, well, I hate all these games anyway. Okay, I'll just whatever. That would be my approach. The problem is some of them are pretty good. I mean, the ratio can vary, but and then finding out that a game that you really like is destroyed and you can never play it again, that just bothers me. Just I mean, yes, it is just games, but it bothers me on a fundamental level. I mean,
Well, it is something that we're seeing overall in consumerism in general. My wife's parents, when they were buying a new oven, they said you can't use the air fry mode unless you let it be connected to the internet,
oh
which also
wow.
means they could disconnect it when they feel like. So we're all just being walked back into this position where you're paying more money for worse products, and if somebody decides, you lose access to it, and there's nothing you can do.
Yeah, I mean, if it was just worse products, as long as there is an alternative for, like, again, a cooker, well, again, yeah, it is pretty wasteful to do that, but that's something that I think probably wouldn't stick, or maybe it would. But with games, I've heard technically they're considered, well, lots of creative works, not just games, but they're considered creative monopolies under copyright because the idea is if somebody makes well you talk about board games, something like Monopoly. Okay, you can't just go, Milton Bradley publishes that uh you can't just go and get a competitor to also publish Monopoly because Milton Bradley owns the rights to it. So if you wanted to play that specific game, then there's nowhere else to go. So it's kind of a captive audience. Like in one of my videos, the analogy I made was uh you can't, there's the book Dracula. You can't just pick up a copy of Twilight and have that be a replacement just because they're both about vampires. Where something like an oven, well, if it cooks the food, then yeah, that can be an adequate replacement if there's another brand. But you
And there's
don't.
also a problem where, they may put out a new edition of Monopoly, but they won't then break into your house and steal the one that you already own. And with
Yes,
games, that's essentially what happens now. Whether you paid for it or not, they'll just say, you don't get it ever again. There's nothing you can do. And it is, to be clear on what your initiative is doing, you're not saying that having a connection to an online server is necessary, and you're not saying that they should support games indefinitely, because it could be
Oh yeah,
impossible if
yeah.
something requires a server. It's just if a game doesn't have to be connected, just to give the audience some
Oh,
option, some way to run it themselves, something other than losing access to it
oh
forever.
no, I'm going farther than that. I'm saying if you are selling a game, and of course they'll argue about what you're being sold also in various countries. If you're selling a game to the customer, then when you're done ending support, there needs to be a reasonable chance to run it in some form. That doesn't necessarily need to mean 100% of all features, especially if they was required like active support, that sort of thing. But there needs to be something, not just it's usually called a bricked copy of a game, whereas as in it doesn't do anything. No, I'm not. I don't consider it an excuse if they've designed it to depend on the online support. I mean, I'm not against that while they're actively supporting it, because there can be reasons to do that. It's the try. It's the just providing no recourse whatsoever to the customer. This wouldn't be tolerated in many other industries. Although, like you said, it's kind of creeping in, and the laws aren't really written for this sort of scenario because, like you said, nobody's going to break into your house and buy an older board game, buy a board game that's out of print or out of that you bought 10 years ago, because that you basically have to go to feudalism before something like that would be a risk, where okay, this is, even though you're living on the land, this is the Lord's land, and they could come into your house at any time if they decide like you have too many chickens or something, so it challenges the concept of ownership just at face value.
They're slowly walking us back into this position where they can design something in a way that is purposefully anti-consumerist, and it just becomes normal. I find it so strange that people in the gaming community have any arguments against the fact that they shouldn't be able to steal something that you've already paid them for.
I think that's a combination of two things. One, I think it might even be kind of a Stockholm syndrome effect, where they like the game, so here's somebody saying something negative about the game. So part of their brain decides like they can't separate how they feel emotionally about that game versus what's being said as far as how it's objectively being treated. So they side on whatever the game's doing. And the other side is, especially for younger people, this may largely been all that they know. That this is they just see this as an innate thing, and I'm just sounding like a crazy or out of touch person saying that like, no, this is not actually necessary even on a technical level. I mean, it can be quite complicated, but from there's no reason it has to be like this. Like for games that have already been made and had no consideration whatsoever for the player, yes, that can get ugly trying to transition that. But if you were to create a new game in the future that you knew had to be online, but then it was also known players should have a way to play it after the fact, then that it does not need to be the issue that it is.
And it was one of your recent videos where you laid out a lot of different options. Like they could release the source code, or they could create some method of letting players run a server on their own. Would you be able to just run through those a little
Sure,
bit so people have
off
an
the top of my
idea?
head, they could patch the game so that it. So this is going to scale depending on what kind of game it is too, because like an MMO with thousands of people, that's a different animal than something like an arena shooter where there might be 5 to 8 other players just in a room. So it can vary wildly, but the first option I would say is patch the game to have an offline mode so you can just run it offline, or just connect to other people. If it's meant to be online multiplayer, just connect to other people directly, which is how almost all multiplayer used to be in like the 90s and the early 2000s anyway. Uh, the second option would be uh, you release a form of the server that people can run on their computers. So it's like you were sold the client, but then they also give you the server software so that people can host it independently and the company can wash its hands of the matter. Another one, like you mentioned, is release the source code to the server. Now, that's a radical option for many companies, but some of them, they just don't care because they're done with the game. They made their money. They're moving on to other projects. So this isn't an issue. Those are really the main viable ones. However, if you want to do like, I think what I was calling like bare minimum effort, you can keep going and the community could probably restore it. One is to just decrypt all the information that's being transmitted because it's encrypted to prevent stuff like piracy or cheating. But once they're done selling the game, there's not really a need for that. And then releasing documentation on how the networking protocols work for that game, because they're going to have internal notes on this. So even if they're actually giving the player nothing in terms of files, just unlocking them and giving lots of information could give, people knowledgeable in programming, and they could have a chance of creating a server emulator, an honest chance of repairing it, so to speak.
It is important for the audience to understand that the destruction of games that's happening isn't even something that benefits them financially. But to speak more specifically about this project, The Crew is a game released by Ubisoft. It's a racing game where it's got not totally accurate, but the entire contiguous United States you can drive around, and it's about to or has just been delisted so that even if you own the game, you're not able to access it anymore.
Oh, it's more than delisted. Delisted means they're just taking it off of store shelves. If you bought a copy of a game but it's been delisted, normally you can still play it indefinitely. So, but this is more, no, this is a shutdown, meaning literally everyone who ever played that game, they cannot play it now. And they had at least 12 million players.
And so
So
the efforts that you'll find if you go to stopkillinggames.com is helping to link people to whatever their country is, the agency that should, some of them actually will, take action on this if they get enough signatures or notification from people. So I
yeah,
hope you will check
this
that out.
this particular game is really just a means to an end. I mean, I like it. I wish it to survive, but that's the coincidence. I almost did this on a different game that I had never even played, but it was a good candidate. We're kind of pursuing this two different ways. One, we're pursuing this game because it had a fair number of players, at least 12 million, so we can still find people with receipts and stuff like that to take consumer action on. The other reason is the company that made it, Ubisoft, are located in France, and France has just night and day consumer protection laws compared to the United States and many other countries. So this is absolutely our best chance to take an action going through government agencies, many of which don't even have rulings on this sort of thing. And the other
And there's a
thing,
problem that a lot of people who are in power, specifically United States Congress, where I live, are too old and just don't understand the technology. They don't know what's going on, and they don't really grasp the fact that people are paying for products and then losing access to them with no warning.
well, not just that, but I mean, there's probably have lobbying efforts also, so that they might be incentivized not to look too deeply into this sort of thing. But the other thing we're doing, which is this part, unfortunately, has been a failure so far, but any day now it could get a lot better. We set up government petitions so that these are going to be direct initiatives to government. So this isn't just like a casual sign this petition and maybe people will care. No, this is something where governments have to respond if they get so many signatures on an issue. And then in some cases, they'll be considered for debate in their lawmaking bodies. We have them set up for the UK, Canada, and Australia, but we've had delays on all of them. They were submitted weeks in advance of this initiative, but they're still stalled. I'm doing everything I can to try and speed it up, but I can only move so fast. So.
Do you have an idea of why you are kind of the only one who's doing this? I mean, it's a huge issue. It's right out in the open, and yet I don't see that much consideration from the community or games journalism about this problem.
I think, well, for games journalism, I think it's the sort of thing where they may also have an incentive not to look at this too closely, because if they're doing it all the time, that may kind of make rockier relations with publishers that they want to cover new games on, which is going to be more their bread and butter for their coverage. Um,
Yeah,
but like,
I'm gonna call Ubisoft thieves in this pretty blatantly, so we'll see how that shakes out.
no problem. I mean that's my perception on it, but it's also standardized within the industry. It's not just Ubisoft. I mean, in terms of games killed, Electronic Arts might be the king. I'm not sure. But yeah, there's other one. Well, again, that's why I said, yeah, these petitions would be have nothing to do with Ubisoft or the crew specifically at all. They would just be going for the throat and saying that, okay, video game publishers that sell games to the public, or game assets in terms of microtransactions, this has to be in a working state in some form when support ends, and it has to not rely on a connection to the publisher or affiliated parties. So those are more
And
general approaches.
because the way it works right now is you could purchase a microtransaction in a game or DLC or an entire game. You pay full price for it. And as far as the publisher is concerned, you haven't really bought anything. You just got a license to use something until one of them decides that you don't have access to it anymore. And there's a lot of variance in how clear they are on that, and also worldwide how legal that practice is.
Exactly. In the US, it's almost hopeless. I'm pursuing one final avenue before I'm just declaring surrender in the US. But in a lot of countries, they don't have clear laws on this, because this hasn't even really been possible for most of history. Uh, to have that online connection, that, again, people aren't coming into your house and taking things that you've already bought, but with the online dependence, it ends up being like that. It kind of reminds me of the analogy I keep using is something like Uber. When that first arrived on the scene, governments weren't sure of, like, wait, are these taxi services, or are these employees or contractors? Like, it just didn't fit neatly into existing laws at all. So it took them a while to kind of figure it out.
And as a similar situation with what's happening with Ubisoft, or not just Ubisoft, the games industry in general, Uber used that lack of clarity to get away with a lot of shady anti-consumerist practices.
And it's the same in the games industry, except it's been going on decades. And
Yeah.
it's like you mentioned, the boiling frog approach. It used to just be MMORPGs that would do this sort of thing. And even then it'd be hazier, because those would operate in the old days, almost all of them use subscription fees. So then it's a clear service saying, okay, you're losing your access after 30 days unless you renew or something. Or so that's a lot harder to come after legally, because it's a service. It's very clearly defined. I mean, I would still bother me from an artistic perspective, but that these games would get shut down and there'd be no way to experience it again. But legally, there wasn't much. But later, you started seeing this practice spill over into one-time purchases, where these are sold as goods and not services, and the service is kind of considered free, and then that would kind of creep on, and then so now we're into very weird territory legally, where, yeah, it may clearly be a violation, but it's been so gradual in implementing this that many governments aren't aware of it.
You have a video from a while ago called Games as a Service is Fraud that I would recommend people check out, where there was some good dialogue following that video, where some people said in some places it isn't fraud legally, but regardless of whether a given country or municipality considers it to be legal, there's no question that it shouldn't be legal. You should not be able to sell something to someone and then take it away from them later on. It's just absurd.
Well, a few people might disagree with you, but I think they're in the single digit percentages on people who are in favor of that. And just a clarification on that video, I stand by everything I said except the United States. I did screw that up. I found out only within the past few months. There was a court case that basically rendered all of it null and void. Pro CD versus Zeidenberg is the name of the case. It kind of the simplest way to explain it is it kind of set the template that the default stance of US law is just to defer to the end user license agreement. So whatever that says goes unless it's just really outrageous and violates stuff very clearly. And in the case of game ownership, of being able to own your game, that's not even on the menu. So it's
I did also want to talk about another dimension of this that you sort of mentioned, which is the artistic issue that you
yeah.
have something where people will put hundreds or thousands of hours into. They might be abused blatantly for it. They might not be paid adequately for it, but they've made something that they probably believe in. And even if an entire game isn't great, there might be a map or music or some part of the writing that people would benefit from experiencing, except now all of that's gone. Somebody decides that it isn't profitable enough to keep it up anymore, so all of that work disappears, and there's no recourse for it.
Yeah, and if it's not profitable enough for them, fine. They can shut it down and let the community handle it, the people who do care about this. Yeah, what you mentioned, that's my personally my motivation behind all this is that it just bothers me on a fundamental level. I compared it to me, it really feels the same as if somebody were to go into a museum and just set fire to paintings. Like that's how I look at it. But I focus so much on the consumer angle because by coincidence, this is also an assault on consumer rights, and there are many more laws on that sort of thing than there are on just art preservation. That's what. So
And we do like historically we consider the lost Shakespeare plays, the lost Aristotle, like horrible tragedies that due to time and lack of preservation we don't have them anymore. And yet now when people are doing it actively, not even for a profit because they're not selling the game anymore, so they're not going to make money off of it. They've just designed it this way. It's considered normal practice.
yeah, well, to play devil's advocate a little bit, there is. It depends on the company culture because I've seen it varies. It is profit motivated, but it's a very small margin, like very small, because there's two angles of it. For all of them, I'd say that since there are no consequences financially of doing this, it's easier to just do nothing than to do even like the bare minimum effort to just let people, let the community handle it. And actually, a lot of developers are against this, but they have to take orders from the publishers most of the time. So if they, so that's one incentive that it's even if it might, especially depending on how it was designed, it could literally just take a couple days of work and then it's done. Well, then that's a couple days of work they don't have to do. So the bean counters will just say, okay, well, just don't do anything then. The other half of it, now this one varies on the company, is for some companies, if it's a franchise, the mentality is that, okay, if we shut down this older game and we have a newer game in that same franchise, then that'll incentivize people to just go and buy the newer game because now they can't play the older one. I think that's not true of all companies, but for some, I've heard there apparently have been some insider statements saying just that. Like, for instance, I do not think that's the case of Electronic Arts. Like, everything about their behavior suggests they just don't care. Like, they don't care when the game goes down. They don't care when, on the rare occasions, some fans manage to get it to come back up. They just seem indifferent. So, in the case of Ubisoft, I'm suspecting it might be the one where they're trying to incentivize people because there's evidence suggesting that they coded an offline mode for this, except it's all encrypted to enable that. So it literally might be as simple as them changing a 0 to a 1 somewhere in the code and then releasing that. Then everybody could run the game indefinitely. However, they have a brand new game in the Crew series that's come out. So maybe they are trying to pursue that method. I don't know. Even then, I think the profits are going to be pretty minimal because the people who are interested in playing old games as opposed to like the brand new exciting thing that's marketed right now, it's always a minority. It's so I don't think they're missing out on that many people doing it. Just letting people who like their older games continue playing their older games, so.
And it is worth mentioning, and you discussed this either in your announcement video for this initiative or one of the ones leading up to it, that if there were a standard where they knew to expect that they couldn't just destroy games, it would be much easier to build it in because they know we'll have to have some option for when we eventually stop supporting this, so it won't take as much work as long as it's something that's expected.
Yeah, an easy analogy, I mean, it's obviously much more complicated, but an easy analogy I would make would be, say you wrote a book and then you realize, oh, okay, we have to have one of the characters in the book by the end. Well, if you've already written the whole story and they get killed in chapter 2, that's a big problem. That's going to take a massive rewrite. But if you haven't written the book yet, okay, well, that's a lot simpler to do. It's like, oh, okay, oh, this character stays alive, that sort of thing.
And it really should be something where you have an end of life plan for something that's going to go offline. Because otherwise, it means, and this is coming up because I write about tabletop. So Dungeons and Dragons is about to do a virtual tabletop where you can do everything, roll the dice, get the minis
Oh,
online. And so there's a question of that's all microtransaction written or based. It's all requires a central server. Hasbro's notorious for deciding things aren't profitable. So what happens to all those purchases you made? Will they
this
just
is
disappear?
100% in the line of fire then for what I'm doing. Yes, exactly. In fact, what I'm doing probably won't save the vast majority of games of this nature right now because the laws can't be retroactive, but it could save ones in the future. So if they're still selling the game or the microtransactions after, assuming we have success after that date, well, then they're liable for that. And it would be in their interest to have an end of life plan.
And I guess that does bring me to the question of what the ultimate goal is. I know you're pursuing this through a lot of different agencies and countries, and you don't know exactly what they'll do, but what you're hoping the next and final steps would be.
Oh, well, I mean, again, I guess the ideal scenario is that in one or more major countries that we're doing this in, some agency decides, nope, this is illegal. This violates this law on ownership or digital goods or something else. Okay, you're getting a fine now that's significant for the company that does this. And then the entire industry is going to see that and think, oh, wow. Like I said, it's not terribly difficult to have an end of life plan for majority of games, and even that goes double for games that are being developed. So they realize, okay, it's going to be cheaper to spend those couple days just having an end of life plan ready for when we shut this down than it is to pay this major fine in this country. And that's a major market, so we want to keep selling there. And then it would kind of solve itself. Like something like this has happened before. In Australia, they sued Valve in 2014 because Valve was not allowing refunds on Steam. Like if you bought the game and said you hate this or it doesn't work on your computer or something, you want to refund it. That used to not be an option. So the ACCC, their consumer commission, sued them. They won, so that became a requirement in Australia. But Valve just made that the global policy because all right, well, we already have to do this here. We don't want to have to fight all these court cases elsewhere and doing it. We've already done the work. This is just global policy now, and now you can get refunds on Steam. So we really just need one good victory somewhere, and that could potentially end all this.
And that shows some of the intelligence of the project that the United States is pretty terrible for consumer protection, but France and a lot of the EU countries are better. And if you say even if you only get one of them, EA learning, oh, we're going to lose access to the entire market of France is not something they're going to like. And if they're forcing a technological or design change, of course, it's something that would have benefits in other places.
And it's the sort of thing where, assuming their financial people can talk to whoever's in charge, they'll understand that in the long term, this cost is almost negligible. Because if they just know it's a requirement from design, it gets dispersed so on such a low level that it's almost nothing for them. I mean, in the in between phase, it can be a little more costly, but it's not something like loot boxes, which a lot of people are upset, which I'm not a fan of, but that's not really my fight because Whereas they make money hand over fist from using loot box models and kind of having gambling mechanics in there. So that's in their interest to fight that to the very end, because then they're going to be losing so much profit for any country that doesn't allow the gambling mechanics in there. Whereas what I'm doing, no, it gets cheap, and it's very cheap if you know it's coming. So I'm trying to keep the scope as narrow as possible, not because I don't think the game industry couldn't improve, but because I have limits with what I can do here. This is already a huge uphill battle trying to make this happen. So if I know that the games just aren't destroyed, then mission accomplished for me. So.
And it is, if there's anyone who's still hanging on, who's suspicious at all, it's important to note that what you're asking for is really not that complicated or expensive from companies who are making so much money that it doesn't matter in order to stop them from destroying their own products that people have worked on and paid for. It's really minimal and reasonable.
Again, to play devil's advocate, there's bound to be a few cases that are a complete mess to deal with. But I'm just thinking forward. That's how you should look at all this. If you're saying if a major company is starting to make a game now, are they really saying like in 4 years this is just impossible? I mean that's a much hard, because I think the framing of a lot of people who are saying, oh, this isn't practical or anything like that, they aren't really looking at the same time scale. And if you need real world evidence, a game recently that was just like this, Gran Turismo Sport, another driving game that relied on the internet. They did a shutdown, and the developers or the publisher basically patched it all to work offline indefinitely now. So now it's essentially safe forever. And there are a few cases like that, but they're way too rare is the problem.
So for anyone, if you want to learn more, again, stopkillinggames.com is the main contact for this. The Accursed Farms YouTube channel is your main site. I'm going to have links to that, your website, everything below this video so you can look into it and learn a little more. Before we sign off, is there anything else that you want to make sure to highlight or that people have an eye out for?
No, just sending people to stopkillinggames.com helps tremendously.
Stop Killing Games, stopkillinggames.com. Pay attention to this and please take action if you can, share it, whatever you're able to do. This is an important issue and I hope to see it succeed. Ross, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me about this and also for unpaid putting all this together, getting activists in order and trying to make a good change for this industry.
Yeah. Well, you're welcome. It's the sort of thing where I wouldn't be able to look at myself in the mirror if I didn't try to. Because it's been bothering me for decades. So.
Well, thanks a lot, everyone. You'll be hearing more about this from me and from Ross in the future, and I just hope for the best success with it.